Welcome to the Cold Steel Surgical Podcast with your hosts Amir Farouk and Chad Ball.
We are delighted to release our new collaborative miniseries on medical legal risks for the surgeon. The Canadian Medical Protective Association and the Cold Steel Podcast have teamed up to release this miniseries exploring some common legal issues that might arise for surgeons. In this first episode you're about to hear, we explore some basic legal issues that surgeons need to be aware of. In the second episode that we have planned, we will explore non-technical skills for surgeons, which are often at the root of many complaints and issues. In our third planned episode, we will explore the innovative theatre arts program developed by the CMPA, which attempts to help participants develop a team culture and improve team engagement.
Dr. Mimeault, thank you so much for joining us today on the Cold Steel Podcast. We are super excited to be doing this collaborative mini-series with the CMPA on medical legal issues that come up for surgeons. And I think most importantly, what we're going to talk about on this series, not quite on this episode, but in the next few episodes, is how to not just avoid medical legal issues or deal with them, but actually how to create a culture within the operating room that helps to mitigate and create a safer culture in all of our operating rooms. So we're really, really excited. And we've been working on this for a few months now. So we're super excited to be finally sitting down and recording this. First, we'd just like to have our listeners learn a little bit more about you. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and where you grew up and where you did your training?
Sure. It's a short story. So I was actually originally born in the Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean area in Quebec, a place I still call home, actually, a really great place. I did most of my training in Montreal. So I did an undergraduate degree at McGill, followed by med school at McGill. Then this back in the day of internships, I did a rotating internship at the Wellesley Hospital in Toronto, a hospital that no longer exists, unfortunately. Probably the best year, the funnest year of training, I would say. That was a lot of fun, the internship. I then did my residency here in Ottawa. Following that, I spent a couple of years at University Hospital in London in their brand new multi-organ transplant unit, where I spent most of my time doing associated with the liver transplant program and learning how to do ERCPs. And then I came back to Ottawa, worked in Ottawa for 27 years, and about 8 years ago in January, I will have joined the CMPA in the learning department.
We want to get right into it with you. And let's talk a little bit about sort of the broad landscape, setting this stage in terms of the scope of the issue that we're chatting about today. So, one of our questions is, how often do legal issues actually arise for surgeons? We're both general surgeons, and so we're particularly interested about specifically how general surgeons compare to other subspecialties in terms of running into medical legal issues. And maybe the provocative question we'll start with right off the hop is, which surgical specialties or subspecialties seem to have the most issues with medical legal problems?
Sure. Maybe we'll go as you suggested, a broader context to start. So almost all physicians in Canada are members of the CMPA. As of last count, that was somewhere in the vicinity of 115,000 physicians. If we look at medico-legal risk, surgeons account for the vast majority of files that get opened at the CMPA. If you look within surgery, the largest group of surgeons is actually general surgery. So again, at the end of 2023, I think there were just shy of 2,000 general surgeons in Canada. And we are responsible in terms of volume for the largest volume of files opened at the CMPA. If you look the last 5 years of data that we have that ended in 2022, that was 795 cases that were attributed to general surgeons. It's important to recognize, too, that while I think most of the medical legal files definitely come to the CMPA, not all hospital complaints, not all college complaints end up as files at the CMPA. A physician might get a college complaint and handle it on their own without the CMPA being aware of it. So the number is probably a little bigger than that, but that's roughly the kind of number you're talking about. And in terms of risk compared to the others, we're about the same. We're not particularly higher than the average of all surgical specialties. But yeah, surgical specialties definitely responsible for most of the preventable harm and medical legal activity in Canada.
I guess that makes sense in that surgeons are, in some ways directly attributable or responsible for complications that patients have in a way that perhaps there isn't the same feeling, at least, or causal link between making a diagnostic error as an internist or some other specialty. Is that sort of the reason why surgery seems to have an outsized footprint with regards to medical legal issues?
I suspect that's part of it, Amir. I think another big part of it is what we do, right? I think when outcomes aren't as expected in surgery, what we're doing is significantly more invasive. The likelihood of harm, be that, severe harm like, permanent impairment or death is higher than it would be in most other specialties.
Yeah, totally. And we had Janice Kwan on the podcast as well, talking about the impact that these types of errors have on patient outcomes and the real harms that is part of the nature of the job. Again, just kind of get a scope for the landscape. What is the percentage of surgeons through their lifetime that will have a medical legal complaint? What are the percentage of surgeons who perhaps never run into any medical legal issues throughout their career?
I love that question. I love that question because, I mean, most of us, if we get a college complaint or a lawsuit, it's not something that we're going to walk around and advertise. I mean, most of us feel, a little ashamed actually that we were the subject of a complaint or a lawsuit. And I can say that as somebody who did have a complaint, a college complaint as a surgeon and an attempt at a lawsuit. You know, not something that you're proud to go around and talk about. But the assumption often is, well, okay, this is a high risk profession, so of course we're going to get some complaints and of course we're going to get some lawsuits. The data is interesting, though. If you look at what our research department's done is looked at a period of 5 years. Over that course of 5 years, 60% of surgeons will never get a complaint or a lawsuit or have anything opened at the CMPA. I guess might file opened at the CMPA might be a more accurate statement. About 25% will have one event over the course of 5 years. And a very small percentage, about 13 or 14%, will actually have two or more events, like a complaint, a lawsuit, that sort of thing, during that period of time. And I think that's actually quite an important observation because, if you did have two college complaints or a college complaint and initiation of a lawsuit in a period of 2 or 3 years, you might actually you should be more likely to think, hey, there's something a little bit different about what I'm doing. A little red flag should go up to say, yeah, I should be thinking about why these things are happening because I know it doesn't happen to the majority of general surgeons. And what are the resources then? Well, we have resources at the CNPA. We have actually a membership support program so that if you're in that category, the membership support program will help you identify, well, what are the factors contributing to you getting into trouble and what are the resources that might help you? And a lot of those resources will be with our department, with learning.
That's really interesting. We recently had Janice Kwan on the podcast talking about sort of the domains and the interaction of the concept of harm with patients and also within the caregiver and the provider side. We're curious, how does the CMPA look at the concept of inherent risk, say, in a procedure or a practice compared to the harm side of it? How do you frame that concept?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. So inherent risk or preventable harm, it really is a determination that happens at the level of the court. So, you get a complaint or a lawsuit, let's say a lawsuit, and, some harm has happened, and the court is going to make a determination, well, was this inherent risk or was this a preventable harm? They are going to rely on peer experts, and peer experts are basically, if I've caused some harm, they might go to you, Amir, or you, Chad, and say, hey, you have a similar practice with Richard Mimeault. Can you have a look at this file and tell us, did what Richard did, was this reasonable care? Did he meet the standard of care? And so you're going to look at, your own experience. You're going to look at best practices, guidelines, policies, all this sort of stuff, and say, yes, he did it. He did what I would have done, or no, he failed to do these things. So if you take the context of say, a frail patient with significant comorbidities who's facing surgery for, say, a colon cancer, and is a fairly high-risk patient, you have a good informed consent. It's a shared decision-making about his risk. You have appropriate risk evaluation ahead of time and risk reduction, and some complication materializes post-op, and you catch it at the right time and you take care of it. Your peer will look at this and say, okay, well, everything was done that could have been done. This is inherent risk. If, on the other hand, there's very little information around the consent, it's not clear that this was an informed consent, that the patient really knew that they were getting into, or that the postoperative complications weren't handled in a timely way, then yeah, you might say, okay, you know what, this patient might have decided not to have surgery based on a good informed shared decision making, and this harm would have been prevented, or this postoperative complication would have been managed better and the outcome might have been different, in which case that would be seen as preventable harm. So could be the exact same situation. It's the interpretation of what happened. And I'm sure we'll get to it, but that interpretation is like super dependent on the documentation, right? Because these things are always being judged in retrospect, and the only way you can know what was done is through what has been documented. So impossible, by the way, to have a chat with the CMPA and not talk about documentation.
Yeah, well, I'm super glad you brought it up. That's exactly what we were going to ask you next is the concept of documentation and what that means. And having worked for a little bit and certainly trained like you and Amir did, I think you see a broad range, I guess I could say, in documentation quality and length and granularity. How do you at the CMPA look at documentation as a concept? And I ask it as a little bit of a biased figure. I have a family member who was a CMPA lawyer in Toronto for a long time. And, those lawyers would say that I think it's safe to say, it's a very, very gray area. And a lot of what is relevant is the discussion that's a verbal or oral in nature between a patient and a physician that may not be documented necessarily in an electronic medical record or a paper chart. I'm curious how you come at it from the CMPA side.
Yeah, I'm going to say there are two sides to the documentation. There is that piece of the documentation that is important because it demonstrates your reasonableness, the reasonable efforts you made to deliver safe and reliable care. The other part of documentation, which is, I'm going to say, equally important, is documentation as a form of communication. The notes I'm leaving behind for my colleague who's going to follow up and needs that information. What your family friend or member who's the lawyer, they're looking primarily at the documentation as a way to demonstrate that you've been reasonable. And it's true, you can't have every single item you've discussed with the patient documented, because some of those conversations are really long, and it would be like a little novella. But what's important is that there is a story there that demonstrates what your reasoning was, and sometimes it's just having that context in there that shows that even though not every single little detail is in there, that there are some details that show that yeah, you did have that depth of discussion with the patient. And so in the era of particularly electronic records and templates and standardized forms, it's really having those little elements of personalization, getting a consent for a cholecystectomy, for example, and the patient saying, my sister had her gallbladder out and she's still having pain 10 years later. I mean, just a note that says, concern re sister who still has pain. it just shows that you have had that kind of a conversation. So it's striking that balance. And again, because that standard is judged in retrospect, the question that we often get when we give sessions on documentation is, well, I do this, is this enough? Well, it's going to depend on the facts and circumstances, right? It's going to depend on the context. So hard to say ahead of time, but basically tell the story, personalize a little bit. Doesn't have to be a novel.
While we're on the topic of peer experts, can you just define for our audience what is a peer expert and what is sort of, we've talked a little bit about their role, but how does a peer expert get chosen and what kind of experience or credentials does a peer expert typically have to have?
Yeah. Yeah, the title is actually a bit misleading because I think it's basically a peer, right? Peer expert. The word peer expert can give the impression that you're getting somebody, the chief of surgery from Mass General or the person who's written the textbook on something, and that's not the case at all. In fact, what the courts are typically looking for in a peer expert is somebody who has a similar type of practice, similar type of experience, to look and say, well, what would I have done in a similar set of circumstances? So the qualifications are really that A, you're able to do it, B, you have the experience of, the lived experience of practicing surgery in that kind of environment, those types of patients. That specialty likely. So, they wouldn't ask an HPB surgeon to be an expert on a colorectal case, for example, that sort of thing.
Does the CMPA have a roster of experts, or how are these folks sort of evaluated and then brought into the fold? And for those of us that have done, a little to a lot of this work, I think everyone takes it seriously and with the appropriate degree of caution and measure. But is there a grading system for experts? And lastly, what do you do when you have an expert that clearly misses the mark from your point of view?
I can answer that by saying, fortunately, I don't have much to do with that. But you're right. I mean, is there there isn't a sort of a grid or some sort of rating to identify who might be a peer that would be reasonable to deal with a particular file. Now, are there peers that the CMPA has called upon before, and that kind of forms a bit of a pool to say, yes, we know this person, they're a colorectal surgeon, and they would be, possibly very good for this case? The answer is yes. You'd have to ask our lawyers. My suspicion is that, if you were a peer expert and it turned out that you were a very opinionated, harsh person, I suspect you probably wouldn't get invited again to contribute to the peer expert pool. But as you said, I think most of us, and especially if you've been under the microscope before, appreciate the retrospective bias that's inevitable when you're looking at a file, and trying to avoid that retrospective bias and really giving an impartial opinion that's not based on you working for the CMPA or working for the patient's lawyer. It's very unbiased. Did this meet the standard of care?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Do you think that the documentation piece of it is sort of a surrogate for knowledge or expertise? Like, do you think that those two things are kind of correlated? Obviously, it's not always the case. Obviously, you could have someone who's supremely good at what they do. They're just not perhaps as good at documenting what they do because they're very busy, et cetera, et cetera. But I sometimes wonder if perhaps that is a bit of a surrogate. We all have seen the notes from, the senior surgeon that within 5 lines can capture the essence and hit the essence of whatever the problem is or whatever their plan is. One of my colleagues here who's a senior surgeon, whenever you read his notes, not only do you get like a deeply personal kind of intimate sense of what the patient was like, they say, oh, this lovely lady who's a Blue Jays fan, like there's a deep sense of who that person was, but then you also immediately get a sense of, okay, what the issue is, what their plan is, and it's very short. So I guess my overall question is, do you think that a lot of the issues or frequent issues that you see as part of medical legal files are due to knowledge or lack of skills?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. Now, vis-a-vis documentation, that would be pretty hard to extricate that from documentation deficiencies. I love the Blue Jays story, by the way. That's like a beautiful piece of personalization, right? I mean, you had to have a pretty good conversation to understand that, unless she was wearing the cap. So one of the things the CMPA is really good at is that because essentially every surgeon in Canada belongs to the CMPA, uh, we have this opportunity to collect a lot of data around all of these events. And for the events that we have a peer expert opinion on, we have folks that do the data collection who are trained to code this and look for, what are the contributing factors? What did the experts say that contributed to this event happening? And interestingly, knowledge and skills is right at the bottom of that list. It's one of the smallest ones, actually. And even within the context of knowledge and skills, it's sometimes knowledge and skills around practice management or even around communication skills. So the vast majority of contributing factors have nothing to do with knowledge and skills. So I'm going to step out on a limb and say that's probably true in the documentation sphere as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious. I don't want to perseverate on this, with the three of us, but if you could give a brief primer or summary on the important elements, sort of must-haves in terms of documentation for a surgeon, maybe in the pre-op visit and then the actual operative report and potentially post-operative note as well. What are sort of the highlights that are absolute must-sees that you sort of can't miss?
So I think in the pre-op, it would be really that issue of informed consent and shared decision making, of understanding what the patient's expectations are. We know that a lot of complaints and lawsuits are really triggered by unmet patient expectations. So just having some real clarity around expectations about what the surgeon can or cannot do for the patient and what the patient's expectations are. I think that's probably the most important part in the pre-op. In the intra-op, again, reflecting what you were saying, Amir, about, detailed from what type of stitch I used and did I put it in backhand or forehand versus, the very nondescript. Again, those parts of the surgery that everybody knows are critical pieces. So, I'll use our most common operation in general surgery. And by the way, the one that shows up in our files most often, cholecystectomy. For sure, describing what you did in order to create that critical view, those sorts of things become really important. Other examples would include, for you, Amir, you're a colorectal surgeon, you're around the ureters all the time. If there is an, accidental injury to a ureter, to have documentation that shows, no, I mean, I know there's a ureter there, and these are the steps I took to identify and protect it. And then in the post-op period, really it's, recognizing events as they happen, documenting what you did at the time to, again, rescue the patient, to identify it, rescue. There's other stuff that happens in the longer post-op period, and also in the pre-op, which is investigation, follow-up, having reasonable systems in place so that if you've ordered an MR on a patient, you actually know that the patient went for it. You actually know that you got the result back and that you've communicated with the patient and that you're doing something with the result.
This segues nicely into kind of talking about systems, right? So we've talked a lot about the personal onus that is on surgeons when it comes to medical legal issues. But how do systems play into medical legal complaints? And I'm thinking about, for example, I'm sure you heard about it. There was this terrible case in the U.S. A couple of months ago where a surgeon actually took out someone's liver instead of someone's spleen. And everyone was so appalled at the surgeon, like, how could you mistake the liver for the spleen? Which, of course, that's inarguable. Can't really say anything about that. Like, that's just a total failure of judgment. But what really bothered me about that whole story was that no one else in the operating room said anything. Like, there was an anesthetist there was a nurse there, or probably multiple nurses there, probably an assistant or a resident. And seemingly no one said anything or did anything to prevent a hepatectomy from happening instead of a splenectomy. So how do systems play into medical legal issues?
I love the example. So when we look at medical legal files, we do try to identify system issues. I would tell you that they're difficult to extricate from a medical legal file, though. So, I mean, if you take the example of a surgical safety checklist, for example, sure, we can look at a file and say, yes, they were compliant. They did a surgical safety checklist because it's in the file, but were they engaged with the surgical safety checklist? Much like the example you're using. I mean, did these conversations happen? Was there a shared mental model created for the day? Did we create the psychological safety and invite people to speak up and cover our backs if needed? So that sort of stuff is very hard to extricate. If you look at all of the patient safety literature, and you look at the bits of systems that we can extract out of medical legal cases, absolutely system issues play a huge role. Having said that, I think, if you think of, I think everybody's familiar with James Reason's Swiss cheese model for systems and system failure. Well, we're that last slice of Swiss cheese, typically, before the harm happens. And so the courts and the colleges are looking at us, and our patients are looking at us saying, well, okay, well, you're the last piece there. What was that reasonable effort that you made to make sure that that perfect storm of system issues didn't affect me? And it's important to realize that it's the expectation on us is that expectation of reasonable effort. It's not perfection. And there have been both courts and college decisions and documents that say, pretty clearly that, you can't be held accountable for system issues. You're held accountable for how you're going to manage them and realize that it's not perfection. It's what can you do to make the situation as best as possible, which is a tough order still, right? I mean, it's still a very high bar to meet.
Yeah, it really is. Richard, the last question I have for you today, from my point of view, that conceptualized, is the concept. It would be great if you could describe what non-technical skills are in general, sort of the softer science side of it, and give the surgical listener here a sense of sort of the differentiation or the commonality between technical factors and non-technical factors in terms of initiation of complaints and difficulty to defend or not.
Absolutely. It's a great question. So I back up to our contributing factors to all of these medical legal events, and the comment earlier that, almost very rarely are knowledge and technical knowledge and technical skills identified as a problem. It's usually things like decision making, teamwork, collaboration, those sorts of things. And those all fall into that category of non-technical skills. It's basically communication and relationships. I mean, nobody's disputing the fact that technical skills are important. Absolutely, that is essential. Nobody wants a surgeon who doesn't know what to cut or how to sew. That is definitely a no-no. What's clear, though, is that as essential as those are, if you want to really deliver safe and reliable care, they are essential but insufficient. What you need to add to that is that whole collection of non-technical skills, which is those relationship elements, the communication elements, and honestly, the pieces that we as surgeons were never really, I'm going to say, taught in a very structured way. We basically learn them through mentorship and sometimes through not ideal mentors either, right? Who had in turn learned it from not so ideal mentors as well. In fact, I remember one of my mentors who I respected immensely. He would always say, look, if you do a good job in the OR, just do your best in the OR and forget about the rest, everything's going to be fine. For sure, you have to do your best in the OR, but that's not enough. That's only one piece of it. So no, non-technical skills, I think, are very much underappreciated. In fact, I think calling them soft skills is a mistake that we're making. I think these are skills that the literature is very clear, there are as teachable, learnable, and applicable as any other skill. And it's in fact, the focus of what we're trying to do in learning at the CMPA with surgical specialties is, how do we promote these non-technical skills? And I think we're looking forward to maybe sharing some of what we're doing with you in another podcast.
Yeah, I'll make a plug for it now. Stay tuned for the other episodes in this little mini series that we're doing, because we're going to delve really deep into a lot of the work that the CMPA has been doing in this regard. Put it together for us. What does it mean in terms of non-technical skills and how that plays into medical legal issues? And maybe just for simplicity, if you just concentrate on the intraoperative aspects of it, like what sort of non-technical skills play into medical legal issues, and how have you seen that come across your desk with files?
But I like that you picked on the intraoperative phase, because if you look at the different phases of care, the intraoperative phase is the phase that is the most frequently associated with medical legal issues. So it's a great place to start. Again, the non-technical skills, I'm going to say that often the ones that we see are related to things like compliance and engagement with surgical safety checklists, for example. And a good example would be a never event, like a sponge left in place or operating on the wrong side, those sorts of things, where you could very easily argue, I think, that has absolutely nothing to do with your technical knowledge or skills. And the type of non-technical skills we're talking about is surgeon showing up late all the time, rushing through the surgical safety checklist, surgeon late because they're on call the night before, and instead of switching call or getting somebody to come and help them the next day, they just say, oh, you know what, fatigue doesn't affect me, I can go ahead and do this. So it's that whole collection of social and cognitive skills ultimately result in you not being a valid participant in the process, but then cascade into something bad happening. There's a whole framework that I hope we'll have a chance to talk about that I think really outlines it beautifully and is, it's very relatable. I think if you're a general surgeon, when you see the framework, it makes total sense.
So fascinating, right? Certainly I think when we all start medical school and then surgical residency, we obsess so much about our ability to throw sutures and have this technical prowess, but so much of what we do has nothing to do with our hands, and so much more to do with our judgment and communication and all these other aspects of what we do. So it's just truly fascinating, and I'm really looking forward to our subsequent episodes in this little mini series. I think part of this is actually how we set up our practice, in terms of how we follow up patients, what our office is like. I often think that our admin assistants or our secretaries have an outsized role, for example, in our patients and their interactions, or even what information gets relayed to us in terms of an issue that a patient is having. Can you talk to us a little bit about, sort of following along with this non-technical skills aspect of it? How does practice management skills factor into medical legal issues?
Yeah, no, also a great question. So practice management does factor in. There's some suggestion, and it's subtle, but in the data that in general, physicians in the first 5 years of practice have a few more problems related to practice management than later in career, which kind of makes sense if you think of it. But you're absolutely right, is recognizing that all of these processes that you have in your office, there are a lot of potentially overlapping roles and responsibilities, and having those very clearly defined is going to be very important. I mean, two examples that stand out in general surgery for me would be, well, they stand out really strongly for me as a HPB because we used to order tons of imaging, CTs and MRIs, and it took forever to get them. And even though they were urgent, but having a process in place so that you could consistently be able to say, no, you know what, we have a system in place to make sure that if we ask for this in 2 weeks, there's something that happens at 2 weeks, which again might be a very clear definition of a role for an admin staff. and that the admin staff knows exactly what to do if that hasn't happened, those sorts of things need to be clearly defined. In fact, I'll put a shameless plug in here, some advertising. We do have a test result follow-up workshop at the CMPA. It's a 3 or 4 hour workshop where we go through test result follow-up and say, okay, well, here are your responsibilities. These are the expectations. It's tough to meet. In your context, let's work on some things to see how we can make that a little safer and more reliable. I think another big place that you all are facing right now is, long wait lists. What happens to patients on wait lists? Who's taking care of them? Who's responsible? And again, having very clear policies and procedures with your admin staff, with your colleagues, with the specialists that you're referring to, with the primary care physicians. And in some provinces where the primary care physician shortage is huge, what are you doing in that context now that you can't rely on the primary care physician? So yeah, no, I think there's huge holes there where potentially patient harm can happen, and you need to have those reasonable mechanisms in place. Again, the family doc shortage is a perfect example. I mean, you're not going to correct that, but what are the reasonable efforts you're going to make to ensure that the patient gets, followed up and is safe?
Yeah, it's a huge issue. You can't really just say, oh, well, your family doctor will get a letter and this is what's going to happen. Certainly a lot of the things that in our practice for colorectal, for example, for colonoscopy results, we're often just calling the patients themselves and saying, this is when you need your next colonoscopy, so that they're in the loop. But yeah, it's not something that you necessarily think about, and certainly don't get exposed to in training. It's like I had no idea what my mentors did for following up on results, or what systems they had in place to make sure something got done in time, how they even coordinate or time their OR lists. There's a whole science behind that. So hopefully we can get into that a little bit more later on in the series. Dr. Mimeault, you've done such a fabulous job today outlining sort of the landscape for us of medical legal issues for surgeons. We've talked about peer review, we've talked about documentation, we talked about the role of non-technical skills and how that relates to medical legal issues. I think the one really important thing that we haven't touched on is the impact that this has on surgeons. And, as a surgeon, I'm curious what your thoughts are and what your feelings are on the impact that these medical legal claims have on surgeons and their families and their partners.
As surgeons, I think we're all aware of the impact it has on our patients, the degree of harm when it happens. And the surgical specialties for general surgery, that's, about of those patients that experience harm, about 6% of them, it's something quite severe, including death. So, and none of us goes to work in the morning thinking something is bad, it's going to happen, certainly not wishing something bad's going to happen. And when these things happen, I think all of us are already pretty hard on ourselves, and it does take an emotional and a psychological toll. I think we all have, to some extent, a bit of imposter syndrome when these things happen. We think, geez, could somebody else have done a better job than me? Or did I really do the best? And then if you compound that with a statement of claim, a few months later that says you're negligent and sloppy, the impact of that is enormous. And I do speak from personal experience, but also just from the calls we get at the CMPA, it's clear that this is a very impactful, stressful, emotionally difficult time for physicians. I think surgeons, a lot of us have been trained to just kind of man up, and just handle it. But the reality is it's a lot more complicated than that. And I don't think that's the right solution. And what we're seeing actually at the CMPA level, or more collectively across the country, is, people actually making significant changes to their practice to the detriment of the delivery of healthcare in Canada. So, restricting their practices to very small pieces that they feel they can control better, or quitting medicine prematurely, completely. So it does have a lot of negative effects. It's also, particularly if you look at lawsuits, this extends over a period of years, right? It's not a one and done. It's something that keeps coming to revisit you over the course of a few years. So No, it does have a very significant impact. At the CMPA, I think we're doing a pretty good job of trying to minimize that impact with the advice we offer to our members. Also, the legal firms that work with the CMPA are very much attuned to the stress and the effect this has on wellness. But definitely, I think collectively as a profession we could do better. And I'm sure, Amir and Chad, you're familiar with some of the wellness literature, places that have instituted processes where when an event happens, a colleague comes to support you, you can have a chat about it if you want to. And I think those things have been shown to have a positive effect on wellness and morale.
Yeah, we had Haytham Kafrani on the podcast a little while ago, and he has done some amazing work on looking at surgeons as a second victim, as well as setting up a peer support system for surgeons. I think that's really critical, and it's so important, I think, for everyone in our audience to know that there are resources out there through the CMPA locally, and I think importantly from your own colleagues as well too. I think just chatting with you and with all your experience and training, everyone at some point will have to deal with this in some way, shape, or form, even if it isn't a formal medical legal complaint. So, having each other to rely on and lean on, I think, is just so important. Well, listen, thank you so much for joining us. And one of the questions that we always ask all of our guests on the podcast, if you could go back in time and give yourself one piece of advice when you were starting off as an early attending, what would that advice be?
There'd be a few, but it would be related to the non-technical skills. It would be related to something around, going to all of this continuing professional development and going to the umpteenth talk on how I do a bile duct injury. I would probably skip that and maybe go to the patient-centered communication workshop, recognizing that there'd probably be more for me to learn there than revisiting the bile duct injury for the umpteenth time just to say, phew, yeah, they're doing it exactly the way I do. When you face a legal complaint or a college complaint, you will hear that the CMPA says, "Oh, don't discuss the details with with peers." And it's important to understand that what they're saying is not to discuss with peers the impact this is having on you. You should actually, if you're comfortable and you have people you can share with, to say, you know what, I'm facing this complaint or this lawsuit, and this is really stressing me out. And the idea, or what they're saying is, don't share discoverable medical legal information with other people. Just stick to the impact this is having on you, and get some support around the impact it's having on you, as opposed to sharing the details.
Well, that was fantastic. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Cold Steel, the official podcast of the Canadian Journal of Surgery. If you have comments or questions, please email us at podcast.cjs@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.